Two things. First of all, Ms. McCall referred to that not having read the Hamas Charter. If you are going to comment on this, you could at least do the people who desire to kill you the decency of trusting their word. And I can tell you that if the people who are attempting to bomb London and Glasgow and are currently wreaking havoc in Baghdad and across the world, if they had their way, I can assure you your own career wouldn't be going the way it is. You wouldn't be the woman you are. You wouldn't be allowed to do what you do in this country. That is the same, and that is the same for everyone in this group. And you should not be, and you should not take that for granted. And one other thing, I should just add to that, there's been a lot of cynicism in this room about this already tonight. But our troops in Iraq did not only go into Iraq for one reason. The people of Iraq had been living under a totalitarian dictatorship for decades, and many people thought that that was our fault. We get blamed when we intervene and when we don't. It was the same in the Balkans. We get blamed when we intervene and when we don't. If you...
In a set of children's books about various religions, couldn't depict Islam's prophet in their book, and that no cartoonist wanted to do it. You want to talk about fear, you want to talk about racism. How about just being an illustrator in Denmark who feels their life's going to be on the line if they draw a picture for a kiddie's book? You want to talk seriously about how it feels to be scared, and then they do a cartoon for their local paper, and that their lives are under threat, and their families are threatened, and they have to go into hiding? You want to talk about what it is to feel threatened?
This is the product of a fevered conspiracy mindset from the beginning. A mindset which is almost messianic in its delusional belief that it can override every single norm of international law, every single norm of criminal law and of national law, and then find itself, and in Mr. Assange's case, in his place of last resort, praising, and I mean it requires a heart of stone not to laugh at this moment, praising the Ecuadorian government for its stand on freedom of speech. I mean, Human Rights Watch found that in 2 weeks of this month alone, the Ecuadorian authorities shut down 6 radio stations and 2 television stations, which they didn't approve of. Ecuador is not a mecca of freedom of speech. It isn't the world capital of decency. It's the last seedy bolt hole to which Mr. Assange thinks he can run.
It's come out today that one of the main reasons Australia went to war in Iraq was for oil.
No, that hasn't come out today. That hasn't come out today, sir. The war was not about oil. If it were, we wouldn't have spent all these billions of dollars in lives and blood and treasure. It was not done for oil. We could have got oil by doing a deal with Saddam like Mr. Chirac did.
Okay, let's move on. That this was there's a war against Islam and a war against the Muslim world.
No, hang on here a moment. The Danish cartoons would not have come to attention if there weren't a group of imams, 2 in particular, who decided to take offence and then take a world tour of taking offence. And then decided to take a world tour of taking offence and show cartoons they'd also made up that were far more offensive than any of the other ones around to other people in order to whip up such sentiment. Ayatollah Khomeini, I don't think, was a reader of Salman Rushdie's early work. I don't think that Ayatollah Khomeini ever sat down with his copy of the Satanic Verses, his advance proof, and then decided to take offence. This is a man willing to take offence. He wanted to take offence. He wanted to whip up other people who don't read books and can't read any long book.
No, you're speaking to...
Dictaphone. Okay, well, yeah. Sorry, Douglas, what were you saying? You were saying...
No, but I mean, it just seems to me that, to an extent, whether you believe this is the case or not, it's dangerous to an extent if you take advantage of the credulous and people's fears and real fears, and people have a real fear of death.
What did Steve see in that?
People have a real fear of death, and they always have done, they always will do. And there are always people who can provide explanations for what happens. If you tell people they're looked after, it makes them feel better than if you tell them they're alone. So people who believe in reason on these things are always at a disadvantage, because we don't have soft fairy tales, and we can't take advantage of the credulous, and we can't claim that angels say rather banal things in our spare time. Not our army and our soldiers having to behave like lawyers, wondering if they're doing something which is going to get them up in a courtroom anytime soon. I don't really want to see this happening with the police. Somebody, the lady in the back there, talked about the scene of the crime. This was not a crime committed by our policemen. These were people who were risking their own lives to protect people like you and me, ladies and gentlemen. And I don't think that we should spit on that and call it a crime or call them criminals. And if I can just finally say that there's an absolute lack of seriousness about this whole debate. Vince Cable said somebody's got to go. Anybody. Let's just get rid of a top-ranking police officer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at a time of serious public safety issues here, we face a real and determined enemy, which must be laughing tonight when they see politicians like Vince Cable calling for just any resignation. Would you be happy that one of the people who knows most in this country about your security and mine should just go on a political whim? I don't think so.
So the issue is not that. The issue is whether or not, in a free society like Britain, we have the right to say what we want and to write what we want and to not be censored, not be killed, not be forced into hiding, not be the subject of fatwas by evil old men.
I'm just saying that is what the general consensus is amongst policymakers, that Iran is not a threat.
Just quickly, before this lady speaks, that's not the consensus at all. That's just not the consensus. It's your opinion.
No, I'm taking the statements by
You're taking very selective statements by certain people.
Well, the US National Intelligence.
We could all cite the opposite.
Should Osama bin Laden have been executed or arrested to face trial?
No, I couldn't disagree more. I'm elated by the death of Osama bin Laden. As I think any decent person should be. The issue of whether or not he was armed is, I mean, obviously Yasmin is an expert in these kind of operations, but if you are one of the military... If I can continue, if you're one of the military personnel in the compound in that situation, you don't know whether he's got a suicide vest, you don't know whether he's going to pull another bomb, and let's get on to the other issues. Firstly, this idea that he could be tried. How can you try Osama bin Laden? Where? When? How do you find a jury that doesn't have opinions about him? How do you find a judge? If anyone's been following the attempts to have a trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in New York, it's proving to be a very, very difficult process, indeed very nearly an impossible one, which is why President Obama has now gone to a military tribunal for that. I think this doesn't demean America. It reminds people of who has been right in this conflict, who the victim is, and who the perpetrator is. Osama bin Laden did not allow any of the 3,000 people in New York and Washington on 9/11 any rights. He took away every single right that any of the people in those cars or their families had. He didn't grant any rights to the families or the victims of the 7/7 subway and bus bombings, which he inspired. It went on, and it's a good thing that the story has now finished.
It hasn't.
It can't be stressed enough how little you take notice of the opinions of people who hate and then burn books they don't read. Such people are not people whose opinions you should be considering.
You mentioned earlier about the huge number of civilian casualties. I can't think of another situation in war in which a fifth of casualties are civilian, and in which the Hamas have suffered up till now perhaps as many as 400 casualties. 400 terrorists being killed seems to me to be good work. It's good work for the future of Israel. It's good work for the future of the region.
Upwards of 75 children have been killed. You can't call them terrorists.
No, I didn't call them terrorists. I said they were innocent civilians. But that 4 times that number of people being killed, the targeted people being killed, are terrorists, and they have been killed, and that can only be good for the region. It can only be good for Israeli security. And if the Arab world really cares about the Palestinian peoples, why doesn't it do something for them practical, instead of whining about this tiny slither of land which Israel occupies? Why don't they realize that if there's going to be peace in the region, it relies on there being a Palestinian solution, and it relies on there being an Israeli solution? That can happen, but the first thing that has to happen is that the Arab governments and the Palestinians realize that Israel isn't going anywhere. If they made that realization, why would they be firing rockets into Israel proper? This isn't disputed territory. They're firing rockets into Israel. Why are they doing?
Douglas, is it more virulent nowadays then than 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago?
What?
Anti-Americanism in Europe, anti-Europeanism in America.
Well, I mean, it's been talked up a lot, yeah. And there are people with an interest in talking it up. It should be stated. Once, for instance, you've written a book saying Europe is in decline, you kind of have a vested interest in it declining, otherwise you'll prove to be an idiot at parties. And vice versa, if you keep on saying that America is the authoritarian Nazi state without parallel in human history, then you kind of have an interest in hoping that American civil liberties are further taken away, in the hope that you'll be proved right in your fatuous thesis. But what I think is happening at the moment is we do have a few people on each side who have kind of blown the ground open a bit. I mean, back to yours, Eurabia is one example. Mark Stein's latest book, America Alone, and then all, of course, of the putrid effusions of Noam Chomsky.
Should the West now have a more sympathetic approach to Hamas in light of their involvement in the release of Alan Johnson?
In the light of Hamas's involvement in the release of Alan Johnston, should the West now take a more sympathetic approach to them? Well, Douglas Murray, you better start on that.
Well, the answer is no. Of course not. I'd like to know who it was who was booing in the audience. I don't know who the Hamas supporter is in the audience there. Hamas is a terrorist organization which makes a fetish out of the murder of Jews. And I'd like to know who it was who thought that that movement was a good thing. This, incidentally, if you don't mind Jew murder, let me tell you what these people were doing just a couple of weeks ago to their own co-religionists in the Gaza, where they went to their next-door neighbors and threw people off buildings and shot people in the back when they were running away. And you think now this is a rehabilitated organization because they posed for the release of a journalist? Because they posed and organized that to look good?
It's a good move. It's a good move when anyone feels that they can say what they believe, and to do so with freedom, impunity, and without fear of threat. So I'd mention that, and I'd also mention the very good and exciting news of the death of Bernard Manning, which I think is a great development this week, and a great success and pleasure for Britain.